I never thought I'd find myself staring across a restaurant table at someone who looked exactly like the love of my life who died in a car accident 2 years earlier. But that's exactly what happened when I agreed to meet someone who'd been using his dead brother's identity to manipulate my grief and lure me into the most psychologically devastating experience of my life. The whole nightmare began when I received a message on Instagram from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was blurry, but the message was specific enough to get my attention. I know this might sound crazy, but I think we have a mutual connection through someone named Josh. Would you be willing to talk? Josh had been my boyfriend for 3 years before he was killed by a drunk driver on his way home from work. His death had shattered my world completely, leaving me struggling with grief that felt impossible to overcome. Even 2 years later, I still found myself looking for him in crowds, dreaming about conversations we'd never have, wondering what our life together might have been like. The person messaging me claimed his name was Jake, and that he'd recently discovered some of Josh's belongings while cleaning out a storage unit that had apparently been rented under both their names. He said he'd found letters Josh had written but never sent, along with photos and mementos from our relationship that Josh had apparently kept private. I know this must be painful for you, Jake's message continued, but I thought you deserved to know how much you meant to him. He wrote about you constantly. I think he was planning to propose. The possibility that Josh had been planning to propose was something I'd wondered about countless times since his death. We'd talked about marriage in abstract terms, but he'd never made any concrete plans that I knew of. The idea that there might be letters or other evidence of his intentions felt like a gift I'd never expected to receive. Jake said he'd prefer to meet in person to give me Josh's belongings, explaining that some of the materials were too personal and valuable to trust to mail or digital transfer. He suggested coffee at a quiet cafe where we could talk privately about Josh and what he'd apparently never had the chance to tell me. I should have been suspicious about someone I'd never heard of who claimed to have shared a storage unit with Josh, especially since Josh had never mentioned having any siblings or close family members other than his parents, who had both died several years before I met him. But grief had made me desperate for any connection to Josh, any piece of him I hadn't already discovered and treasured. Jake chose a small cafe in a part of town I'd never been to, explaining that he lived nearby and it would be convenient for him to bring Josh's belongings. When I arrived, I looked around for someone who might fit the vague description he'd given me of himself, but I didn't see anyone who seemed to be waiting for a meeting. Then I saw him sitting in a corner booth with his back to the entrance, and my legs nearly gave out from shock. From behind he looked exactly like Josh. The same height, the same hair color and style, the same broad shoulders that I'd known so well. When he turned around to wave at me, I felt like I was seeing a ghost. Jake looked exactly like Josh in every detail that mattered. Same facial features, same eye color, same smile that had made my heart skip during the 3 years we were together. If I hadn't known with absolute certainty that Josh was dead, I'd been at his funeral, had watched his casket being lowered into the ground, I would have sworn I was looking at my dead boyfriend. I know this must be shocking, Jake said as I sat down across from him with trembling hands. Josh and I were twins. Identical twins, obviously. We were separated when we were very young and grew up in different families. I only found out about him a few months ago. The story Jake told was elaborate and emotionally devastating. According to him, Josh had been searching for his biological family before he died, and had recently made contact with Jake through a private investigator. They'd been planning to meet in person when Josh was killed, leaving Jake with a storage unit full of belongings and no way to connect with the people Josh had cared about. He wrote about you in journals he kept, Jake said, pulling out a notebook that looked exactly like one Josh used to carry. Pages and pages about how much he loved you, how he was planning to propose on your birthday next month, how excited he was about building a future with you. As Jake read passages from what appeared to be Josh's handwriting, I felt like my heart was being torn apart and rebuilt at the same time. These were thoughts and feelings I desperately wanted to know Josh had experienced, proof that our relationship had meant as much to him as it had to me. But something about Jake's story didn't quite add up. Josh had never mentioned being adopted or having any biological siblings he was trying to find. He'd been close with his adoptive parents and had never expressed any curiosity about his birth family. The idea that he'd been conducting a secret search for a twin brother felt completely unlike the Josh I'd known. I know this is a lot to process, Jake said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Maybe we could continue this conversation somewhere more private? I have more of Josh's things at my apartment, including some videos he made for you that he never had a chance to give you. The possibility of seeing videos Josh had made specifically for me was too tempting to resist, despite the growing unease I felt about Jake's story. I agreed to go to his apartment, telling myself that I needed to see everything Josh had left behind before I could begin to process this impossible situation. Jake's apartment was decorated with photos and mementos that looked exactly like things Josh would have chosen. The same taste in art, the same books on the shelves, even similar furniture to what Josh had owned. But something about the space felt staged, like someone had carefully recreated Josh's aesthetic without understanding the personal meaning behind his choices. "Before I show you the videos," Jake said, pouring 2 glasses of wine, "I need to tell you something else. Josh didn't just write about loving you. He wrote about how guilty he felt for keeping secrets from you. There were parts of his life he never shared, things he thought you might not understand." What Jake revealed next was so shocking and disturbing that I almost couldn't process it. According to him, Josh had been living a double life that included criminal activities I never could have imagined him being involved in. Jake claimed to have evidence of Josh's involvement in various illegal schemes, including documentation of debts and obligations that had supposedly been transferred to Jake after Josh's death. "The people Josh owed money to don't care that he's dead," Jake said, his demeanor shifting from sympathetic to menacing. "They expect his debts to be paid by his family, and since I'm his only living relative, that responsibility falls to me. Unless, of course, there's someone else in Josh's life who might be willing to help resolve these obligations." I realized with growing horror that Jake was trying to manipulate me into taking financial responsibility for debts that Josh had supposedly incurred. But the more Jake talked about Josh's alleged criminal activities, the more convinced I became that everything he was telling me was a lie designed to exploit my grief and love for Josh. The real Josh had been honest to a fault, sometimes painfully transparent about his thoughts and feelings. The idea that he'd been maintaining elaborate criminal enterprises without me knowing was so contrary to his character that I knew Jake had to be lying about that part of his story. But if Jake was lying about Josh's supposed debts and criminal activities, what else was he lying about? I started looking more carefully around his apartment, and I began noticing details that suggested this wasn't the home of someone who had recently discovered he had a dead twin brother. The photos on Jake's shelves weren't just similar to things Josh would have owned. They were actual photos from Josh's apartment, items I recognized from the 3 years we'd spent together. Jake hadn't inherited these belongings from a storage unit. He'd taken them from Josh's apartment, probably before or shortly after Josh's death. "Jake," I said, standing up from the couch where I'd been looking through what he claimed were Josh's journals, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you really Josh's twin brother, or is there something else going on here?" Jake's expression changed instantly, dropping the sympathetic mask he'd been wearing throughout our conversation. "Does it matter?" he said coldly. "You wanted to feel connected to Josh again, and I've given you that experience. You wanted to believe he'd been planning to propose, and I've provided evidence of his intentions. What difference does it make how you got what you were looking for?" The psychological cruelty of what Jake had done was staggering. He'd exploited my grief to manipulate me into a situation where I was emotionally vulnerable and isolated, then revealed that the entire experience had been a performance designed to extract money from me. But the worst part was realizing that Jake really did look exactly like Josh, which meant he'd been deliberately using that resemblance to torture someone who was still mourning the person he looked like. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or coincidental resemblance. Jake had specifically targeted me because he knew the psychological impact his appearance would have on someone grieving Josh's death. I managed to get out of Jake's apartment and immediately called the police to report what had happened. The investigation that followed revealed that Jake was a con artist who specialized in targeting grieving family members and partners of deceased people. He'd somehow obtained Josh's personal belongings and had been studying Josh's life and relationships to create convincing impersonations for various fraud schemes. Jake wasn't Josh's twin brother. He was someone who happened to have a strong physical resemblance to Josh and had been using that resemblance to exploit people who'd cared about him. He'd targeted Josh's parents shortly after the funeral, his former co-workers, and several other people in Josh's life, always with different stories designed to extract money or personal information. The belongings Jake had shown me weren't things Josh had left behind. They were items Jake had stolen from Josh's apartment before his family had a chance to clean it out. The journals with Josh's supposed thoughts about our relationship had been created by Jake based on information he'd gathered about our time together. It's been 8 months since that devastating fake meeting with someone I thought was Josh's brother, and I'm still working through the psychological damage of having my grief weaponized against me. The experience taught me that there are people who will exploit the most sacred and painful emotions for their own benefit. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that grief makes us vulnerable to manipulation in ways that are difficult to recognize and protect against. If someone contacts you claiming to have belongings or information about a deceased loved one, verify their identity thoroughly before agreeing to meet or provide any personal information. The person I was before meeting Jake was still raw with grief and desperate for any connection to Josh. The person I am now is more cautious about protecting myself from people who would exploit that vulnerability, but also more determined to honor Josh's memory in ways that aren't dependent on discovering new information about our relationship. Trust your instincts if someone's story about a deceased loved one doesn't align with what you knew about that person's life and character. Grieving people are often targeted by criminals who understand exactly which emotional buttons to push to overcome normal caution and skepticism. Your grief is precious and deserves to be protected from people who would use it as a tool for manipulation and exploitation. The love you feel for someone who has died belongs to you and to them, not to anyone who would corrupt that connection for their own purposes. I never thought I'd discover that the charming, consistent person I'd been messaging for weeks was actually a team of 3 different people coordinating an elaborate deception, but that's exactly what happened when I agreed to meet someone who turned out to be part of the most sophisticated catfishing operation I could have imagined. What started as promising online chemistry turned into a psychological nightmare when I realized I'd been manipulated by multiple strangers working together to exploit my trust and emotions. The whole ordeal began when I matched with someone named Marcus on a dating app that marketed itself to professionals seeking serious relationships. His profile was impressive but not intimidating: successful marketing executive, well-traveled, articulate about his interests in photography and hiking. After months of disappointing matches with men who seemed more interested in games than genuine connection, Marcus felt refreshingly mature and straightforward. Our initial conversations were engaging and intellectually stimulating. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about my work as a graphic designer, shared interesting perspectives on creative industries, and seemed genuinely curious about my thoughts on everything from art to current events. What impressed me most was the consistency of his communication style. Always articulate but warm, intellectually engaging but emotionally available. Over the course of 3 weeks, we exchanged hundreds of messages covering every topic imaginable. Marcus seemed to remember every detail from our previous conversations, building on shared interests and references in ways that made me feel truly seen and understood. He had opinions on books I loved, experiences that paralleled mine, and a sense of humor that perfectly complemented my own. When Marcus finally suggested we meet for coffee, I was genuinely excited about the possibility of finally connecting with someone who seemed like genuine relationship material. He chose a cozy cafe downtown and suggested we meet on Saturday afternoon. Casual, public, perfect for a first encounter between people who'd built such strong rapport through messaging. Marcus arrived exactly on time and looked reasonably similar to his photos, though something about his presence felt different from what I'd expected based on our conversations. He was attractive and well-dressed, but his energy seemed more reserved than the confident, engaging personality that had come through in his messages. The first hour of our coffee date went well enough, though I noticed Marcus seemed to be checking his phone more frequently than seemed natural for someone who was supposedly excited to finally meet me in person. When I mentioned this, he apologized and explained that he was dealing with some urgent work issues that couldn't wait. But about halfway through our conversation, something shifted in Marcus's demeanor that was so subtle I almost missed it. His speaking style changed slightly, different vocabulary choices, different rhythm of speech, even different opinions on topics we'd discussed extensively through messages. When I brought up a book he'd enthusiastically recommended just days earlier, he seemed confused about the details and couldn't remember why he'd suggested it. "Sorry, I've been reading so much lately that everything's starting to blur together," he said, but his explanation felt forced and unconvincing. The Marcus who'd messaged me had been passionate and specific about his literary preferences, not someone who would casually forget books that had apparently meant enough to him to recommend to someone he was trying to impress. As our conversation continued, I noticed more inconsistencies between the person sitting across from me and the personality I'd gotten to know through weeks of messaging. The online Marcus had been confident and opinionated about photography, sharing detailed knowledge about camera equipment and techniques. But when I asked about a specific camera model he'd mentioned owning, in-person Marcus seemed vague and uncomfortable with the technical discussion. Most unsettling was when Marcus excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving his phone on the table. The screen lit up with a text message that I couldn't help but notice. "Your turn in 20 minutes. He's asking about the photography stuff you don't know. Switch topics to travel." I stared at the message, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone was apparently coordinating Marcus's conversation topics and providing him with directions about how to handle our date. But why would someone need coaching for a conversation with someone they'd been talking to naturally for weeks? When Marcus returned, I decided to test my growing suspicions by asking him about a very specific travel story he'd shared with me through messages. A detailed account of getting lost in Barcelona and discovering a hidden tapas bar that became his favorite restaurant in the city. The online Marcus had been passionate and specific about this experience, describing the food, the atmosphere, even the name of the street where the restaurant was located. But in person Marcus looked blank when I brought up his Barcelona story. He tried to cover by saying he'd traveled to so many places that specific details sometimes got mixed up, but it was clear he had no memory of the story I was referencing. This wasn't someone forgetting minor details about a casual anecdote. This was someone who'd never had the experience he'd supposedly shared with me. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice calm but direct, "I need to ask you something. Are you the same person I've been messaging with for the past 3 weeks?" His expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like panic before he forced a smile. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" But I could see him glancing toward his phone, probably hoping for more coaching from whoever had been sending him directions. I realized that the person sitting across from me might not even know the details of all the conversations I'd had with Marcus online. I excused myself to go to the bathroom and immediately called my best friend Sarah, whispering a quick explanation of what I suspected was happening. She told me to get out of there immediately and promised to pick me up outside the cafe within 10 minutes. When I returned to our table, I told Marcus that I wasn't feeling well and needed to head home. He seemed relieved rather than disappointed, which confirmed my suspicions that he wasn't emotionally invested in spending time with me. As I gathered my purse and jacket, I noticed him typing rapidly on his phone, probably reporting back to whoever was coordinating this elaborate deception. That evening, I did what I probably should have done weeks earlier. I reverse-searched Marcus's photos and did extensive online investigation into his claimed background and personal details. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying in its complexity. The photos Marcus had used belonged to a real person named David Chin, a marketing professional from Seattle who had no idea his images were being used for dating deception. But the investigation also revealed evidence of a much more sophisticated operation than simple catfishing. Through social media analysis and reverse image searches, I found traces of the same photos being used across multiple dating platforms with different names and backgrounds. The same face was claiming to be a lawyer in Miami, a photographer in Denver, and a consultant in Chicago, all with different ages, interests, and personal histories. But most disturbing was discovering what appeared to be a coordinated network of fake profiles, all managed by the same operation. Cross-referencing writing styles, photo metadata, and activity patterns revealed at least dozens of fake accounts being operated by what seemed to be a team of people working together to maintain multiple false identities simultaneously. I reported everything to the police and to the dating app company, providing documentation of the messages, photos, and evidence of coordinated deception. The investigation that followed revealed an operation that was far more extensive and organized than I'd imagined. Marcus had actually been 3 different people taking turns managing his online persona and conducting in-person meetings. They developed an elaborate system for sharing information about their targets, coordinating conversation topics, and maintaining consistent personalities across multiple fake relationships. The person I'd met for coffee was just the face of the operation. Someone who resembled the stolen photos closely enough to pass for casual meetings. The other 2 members of the team handled most of the online messaging, using detailed notes and scripts to maintain personality consistency across their various fake identities. Their operation targeted dozens of women simultaneously, using psychological manipulation to build emotional connections that could be exploited for various purposes. Some victims were defrauded of money, others had personal information harvested for identity theft, and still others were apparently being groomed for more serious crimes that the investigation was still uncovering. What made their scheme particularly sophisticated was how they studied their targets' personalities and vulnerabilities to customize their approach. They'd created detailed profiles of each victim's interests, emotional needs, and relationship patterns, then crafted fake personas specifically designed to appeal to those individual characteristics. The 3 people running the operation were ultimately arrested and charged with fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The investigation led to the discovery of hundreds of victims across multiple states, many of whom had never realized they'd been deceived by a coordinated team rather than an individual catfish. It's been over a year since that disturbing coffee date with someone who turned out to be an actor in an elaborate criminal enterprise, and I'm still processing the psychological impact of learning that multiple strangers had been studying and manipulating me for weeks. The experience taught me that online dating deception can be far more sophisticated and organized than most people realize. What seems like a personal connection with an individual might actually be a calculated manipulation by a team of criminals working together to exploit emotions and trust. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that if someone's online personality doesn't match their in-person presence, if they seem confused about conversations you've had or experiences they've shared, or if they appear to be receiving coaching during your interactions, those could be signs of coordinated deception rather than simple nervousness or forgetfulness. The person I was before meeting the fake Marcus was optimistic about online connections and willing to invest significant emotional energy in getting to know someone through messaging. The person I am now is more skeptical of perfect compatibility and more aware of how criminal organizations can weaponize romance and emotional manipulation. Trust your instincts if something feels inconsistent about someone's personality or memory of your shared conversations. Individual catfish are dangerous enough, but organized teams with resources and coordination represent a much more serious threat to your emotional and financial security. Your feelings and trust are valuable, and you deserve authentic connections with real people who are genuinely interested in knowing you as a person rather than exploiting you as a target for criminal enterprises. I never thought accepting a dinner invitation would lead to discovering that my death was being broadcast live to paying subscribers, but that's exactly what happened when I trusted someone who'd turned killing into interactive entertainment where viewers could vote on how their victims should die. What seemed like a romantic evening with someone charming turned into the most horrifying realization that I was the unwitting star of a snuff film being produced for an audience that had paid to watch me be murdered. The whole nightmare started when I matched with someone named Vincent on a dating app that catered to creative professionals. His profile suggested he was a filmmaker and photographer, with artistic photos and thoughtful commentary about visual storytelling that immediately caught my attention as someone who worked in graphic design. After weeks of matching with people who seemed shallow or uninteresting, Vincent's creative perspective felt refreshing. Our conversations over several weeks were intellectually stimulating and creatively inspiring. Vincent shared fascinating insights about filmmaking techniques, discussed obscure art house movies I'd never heard of, and seemed genuinely interested in my work designing marketing materials for independent artists. He had a sophisticated understanding of visual composition and storytelling that made our conversations feel like masterclasses in creative thinking. What impressed me most about Vincent was his apparent passion for pushing artistic boundaries and exploring themes that conventional media wouldn't touch. He talked about creating experiential art that blurred the lines between performance, documentary, and fiction. His descriptions of his current project sounded avant-garde and ambitious. Something about creating authentic emotional responses through immersive experiences. When Vincent invited me to dinner at his loft apartment, describing it as a space designed specifically for artistic entertaining, I was intrigued by the opportunity to see his creative work firsthand. He mentioned having a small dinner party with other creative professionals, which sounded like exactly the kind of networking opportunity I'd been hoping to find in the art scene. Vincent's loft was impressive: high ceilings, exposed brick walls, professional lighting equipment positioned throughout the space in ways that suggested ongoing creative projects. But what I noticed immediately was how many cameras were positioned around the apartment, all seemingly focused on the dining area where he'd set up an elaborate dinner table. "I hope you don't mind the equipment," Vincent said, helping me with my coat. I'm documenting a performance piece about authentic human interaction in curated environments. The cameras capture everything, but the footage won't be used without explicit consent from everyone involved. The explanation seemed reasonable for someone creating experimental art, and I was curious about being part of an artistic project that might challenge conventional ideas about privacy and performance. Vincent seemed respectful about consent and artistic boundaries, which made me comfortable with being filmed during our dinner. But as the evening progressed, I started noticing that we seemed to be the only people at what Vincent had described as a dinner party. When I asked about the other guests, Vincent said they'd been delayed and might join us later, but something about his explanation felt evasive. I also noticed that Vincent kept glancing at monitors positioned around the apartment that appeared to be displaying live feeds from the various cameras. Occasionally, he'd pause mid-sentence as if he was reading something, then steer our conversation in slightly different directions based on whatever information he was receiving. About an hour into dinner, Vincent excused himself to check on something in another room, leaving me alone at the table. That's when I noticed one of the monitors was displaying what looked like a chat interface with hundreds of messages scrolling by rapidly. The comments appeared to be discussing our dinner in real time, with viewers making observations about my appearance, personality, and responses to Vincent's conversation topics. But the comments weren't just observational. They were directive and increasingly disturbing. Viewers were suggesting topics for Vincent to bring up, voting on what should happen next in our evening, and making requests that became progressively more violent and sexual as I scrolled through the chat history. The most chilling discovery was a pinned message at the top of the chat that read, "Tonight's interactive experience, Vincent and his dinner guest. Subscribers vote on escalation scenarios. Premium members unlock special request privileges. Final outcome determined by highest bidder." I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just being filmed for an art project. I was the unwitting star of some kind of interactive violent entertainment where paying viewers could influence what happened to me. The performance piece Vincent had described wasn't experimental art. It was a snuff film being produced for an audience that had paid to watch someone be tortured and killed. When Vincent returned from the other room, he was carrying what appeared to be professional restraints disguised as artistic props. "I hope you're ready for the next phase of our experience," he said, his demeanor shifting from charming artist to something cold and calculating. "The audience has been very engaged with your performance so far, and they're eager to see how you respond to more challenging scenarios." I tried to maintain composure while looking for opportunities to escape, but Vincent had positioned himself between me and the apartment's exit. The cameras were capturing every moment of my growing fear, and I could see the chat interface lighting up with excitement as viewers realized that the evening was about to escalate into violence. "Vincent," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I don't consent to whatever you're planning. I want to leave now." His smile was terrifying in its complete lack of warmth or humanity. "I'm afraid leaving isn't an option at this point," he said, moving closer with the restraints. "The audience has paid significant money to see this experience through to its conclusion, and they've voted overwhelmingly for scenarios that require your continued participation." That's when I understood that Vincent had never seen me as a person. I was content for his paying subscribers, a victim whose terror and death would be monetized for the entertainment of people sick enough to pay for interactive murder. The sophisticated artistic discussions we'd shared had been part of his recruitment strategy, designed to identify someone creative and trusting enough to be lured to his killing studio. I managed to grab a wine bottle from the table and swing it at Vincent's head, giving me just enough time to reach the door. But instead of leading to a hallway, the door opened onto another room filled with more cameras and what appeared to be previous victims' belongings arranged as trophies. I could hear Vincent behind me, probably explaining to his audience that my escape attempt was part of the entertainment they'd paid to see. The chase through his apartment was being broadcast live to hundreds of subscribers who were voting on whether Vincent should catch me quickly or let the pursuit continue for their amusement. My salvation came when I managed to reach a window and began screaming for help while Vincent tried to drag me away from it. A neighbor called police, who arrived just as Vincent was attempting to sedate me with what appeared to be veterinary tranquilizers he'd prepared for the next phase of his interactive murder show. The investigation that followed revealed that Vincent had been operating this streaming murder service for over a year, targeting victims through dating apps and social media before luring them to his studio for live executions. His subscriber base included hundreds of people around the world who paid substantial fees to vote on torture methods and murder scenarios. Vincent's apartment contained evidence of at least 12 previous victims who had been killed during similar interactive experiences. He'd been earning hundreds of thousands of dollars from subscribers who paid premium rates to request specific forms of violence and to vote on how long victims should be kept alive for maximum entertainment value. The streaming platform he'd used was part of a larger dark web network that specialized in interactive violent content, connecting killers with paying audiences who wanted to participate in real murders from the safety of their own homes. Vincent had been one of their most popular performers, with a waiting list of people wanting to be his next victims without realizing what they were volunteering for. It's been over 8 months since that horrifying evening when I nearly became interactive entertainment for people who pay to watch strangers die, and I'm still processing the psychological trauma of learning that my murder would have been a collaborative effort between Vincent and his paying audience. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that the dark web has created markets for every form of human cruelty imaginable, including interactive murder where viewers can participate in killing real people through voting and financial contributions. If someone seems overly interested in filming you, especially in private settings with professional equipment, if they mention creating experiential art that pushes boundaries, or if you notice evidence of live streaming capabilities during dates, trust your instincts and prioritize your safety over politeness. The person I was before that fake dinner date was curious about experimental art and willing to participate in creative projects that might challenge conventional boundaries. The person I am now understands that some people exploit artistic rhetoric to disguise crimes that are far more horrific than traditional violence because they involve collaboration between killers and paying audiences. Your life is not entertainment for people sick enough to pay for interactive murder, and anyone who tries to turn your death into a collaborative experience between themselves and their subscribers deserves no consideration for their artistic vision or creative boundaries. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who disguise their crimes as art, using sophisticated cultural references and creative language to make their victims feel like willing participants in something meaningful rather than unwilling stars in someone else's profitable murder show. I never thought accepting a coffee invitation from someone I'd matched with on a dating app would lead to discovering that my own therapist had been conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on me. But that's exactly what happened when I realized the charming man sitting across from me was the same person I'd been paying to help me work through trust issues from previous relationships. The whole nightmare began when I matched with someone named David on a dating app that catered to educated professionals. His profile was thoughtfully written and intellectually engaging. He listed his profession as research consultant, mentioned interests in psychology and human behavior, and had photos that suggested he was mature and stable. After months of disappointing matches, David seemed like exactly the kind of person I might actually connect with. Our initial conversations were remarkably insightful and emotionally intelligent. David asked perceptive questions about my perspectives on relationships, seemed to understand complex emotional dynamics without me having to explain them, and had an almost uncanny ability to respond to my messages in ways that addressed concerns I hadn't even fully articulated to myself. What impressed me most about David was how well he seemed to understand my personality and communication style. He referenced things I was passionate about, asked follow-up questions that showed he was really listening, and had opinions on topics that aligned perfectly with my own values and interests. After weeks of surface-level conversations with other matches, talking to David felt like connecting with someone who actually saw and appreciated who I was. I'd been seeing a therapist named Dr. Davidson for about 6 months to work through trust issues stemming from a series of relationships with manipulative partners. The therapy had been incredibly helpful. Dr. Davidson had a gift for understanding my psychological patterns and helping me identify the warning signs of manipulation that I'd missed in previous relationships. When David suggested we meet for coffee at a cafe downtown, I was genuinely excited about the possibility of finally connecting with someone who seemed emotionally mature and psychologically aware. He chose a quiet place that was perfect for actual conversation, and he suggested meeting on a Thursday afternoon when it wouldn't be too crowded or rushed. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early and was scanning the room for someone who matched David's photos when I saw a familiar figure sitting in a corner booth. My heart stopped as I realized I was looking at Dr. Davidson, my therapist, sitting alone at a table and checking his phone as if he was waiting to meet someone. For a moment I wondered if this was just a bizarre coincidence, Maybe Dr. Davidson was meeting a friend or colleague at the same cafe where I was supposed to meet David. But as I stood frozen in the doorway, Dr. Davidson looked up from his phone, made eye contact with me and smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. "Hello, Jennifer," he said, standing up and gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "I'm so glad you could make it." I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience as I realized that Dr. Davidson and David were the same person. My therapist, the person I'd been paying to help me heal from manipulation and trust issues, had been conducting some kind of elaborate deception through a dating app. "Dr. Davidson," I whispered, unable to process what was happening. "What are you doing here? I'm supposed to be meeting someone else." His expression was clinical and detached, like he was observing an interesting psychological phenomenon rather than participating in a massive violation of professional ethics and personal boundaries. "Please sit down," he said calmly. "I think this will be a very productive conversation for both of us." I sat down not because I wanted to, but because I was so shocked and confused that I couldn't figure out what else to do. My mind was racing with questions about how this was possible, what Dr. Davidson's motivations could be, and whether everything about our therapeutic relationship had been built on lies and manipulation. "I know this must be disorienting," Dr. Davidson continued, "but I want you to understand that everything I've done has been in service of your therapeutic goals. You came to me with trust issues and an inability to recognize manipulative behavior in potential partners. Traditional talk therapy wasn't giving you the experiential learning you needed to develop better instincts." As he explained his reasoning, I realized that Dr. Davidson had created the David persona specifically to test whether I would recognize manipulation and boundary violations in a romantic context. He'd been using information from our therapy sessions to craft a dating profile designed to appeal to my specific vulnerabilities and preferences. "The conversations we had through the app were essentially extended therapy sessions," he said, pulling out a notebook where he'd apparently been documenting my responses to his various psychological probes. "I was able to observe your attachment patterns, your boundary-setting abilities, and your susceptibility to certain types of emotional manipulation in real time. The violation was so profound that I could barely speak. Dr. Davidson had weaponized my trust and vulnerability, using the intimate knowledge he'd gained as my therapist to conduct unauthorized experiments on my romantic life. He'd turned our therapeutic relationship into a laboratory where I was an unwitting test subject. This is completely unethical," I managed to say, my voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "You violated every professional boundary that exists. You manipulated me using information I shared with you in confidence." Dr. Davidson's response was chillingly clinical. "Ethics are important, but results matter more. In just a few weeks of this exercise, I've learned more about your psychological patterns than months of traditional therapy revealed. This data will be invaluable for developing more effective treatment strategies." I realized that Dr. Davidson didn't see me as a human being deserving of respect and honest treatment. I was a case study, a source of psychological data that he could manipulate and observe for his own professional interests. The therapeutic relationship I'd trusted was actually a research project where my consent had never been obtained. "How many other patients are you doing this to?" I asked, horrified by the implications of what he'd revealed. His slight smile confirmed my worst fears. "You're part of a larger study I'm conducting on trust formation and manipulation recognition in therapeutic contexts. The preliminary results have been fascinating. Most subjects show significant improvement in boundary recognition after exposure to controlled manipulative scenarios." Dr. Davidson had been running unauthorized psychological experiments on vulnerable people who'd come to him for help with relationship trauma. He was using dating apps to create false romantic connections with his own patients, then studying their responses to manipulation tactics he designed based on their therapeutic disclosures. I left the cafe immediately and drove straight to the state licensing board to file a complaint against Dr. Davidson. The investigation that followed revealed that he'd been conducting these experiments on dozens of patients over several years, always using fake dating profiles to test their responses to various psychological manipulation techniques. The other victims included people recovering from abusive relationships, individuals with attachment disorders, and patients dealing with severe trust issues who'd sought therapy specifically to heal from romantic trauma. Dr. Davidson had exploited all of them, using their deepest vulnerabilities as data points in his unauthorized research. Dr. Davidson lost his license and was charged with multiple ethics violations, fraud, and psychological abuse. The investigation revealed that he'd been planning to publish his findings in psychology journals without disclosing that his data had been obtained through deception and without proper consent from his subjects. But the legal consequences couldn't undo the psychological damage of discovering that someone I'd trusted to help me heal had actually been conducting experiments on my capacity for trust and manipulation recognition. The betrayal was so complete that it took months of work with a new therapist to even begin processing what had happened. It's been over a year since that devastating fake coffee date with my own therapist, and I'm still working through the complex trauma of having my healing process weaponized against me. The experience taught me that even licensed professionals can exploit therapeutic relationships for their own purposes. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that if your therapist seems to know too much about your dating life, if they ask unusually specific questions about your romantic preferences, or if you encounter someone on dating apps who seems to understand your psychological patterns too well, those could be signs of serious professional boundary violations. The person I was before discovering Dr. Davidson's deception was working hard to rebuild my ability to trust after previous manipulation. The person I am now understands that predators can hide behind professional credentials and therapeutic relationships to gain access to victims' most vulnerable psychological spaces. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong about your therapeutic relationship. And remember that legitimate therapists never conduct secret experiments on their patients or use confidential information to manipulate them in other contexts. Your healing journey belongs to you, and no one has the right to turn your recovery process into unauthorized research or psychological experimentation, regardless of what professional credentials they might possess. I never thought accepting a dinner invitation would lead to meeting someone claiming to be me from 21 years in the future, but that's exactly what happened when I agreed to meet someone who knew impossibly intimate details about my life and seemed determined to warn me about choices I was supposedly going to make that would destroy everything I cared about. The whole surreal experience began when I received a message on a dating app from someone whose profile immediately caught my attention. The user went by Sarah2045. And her bio was cryptic but intriguing, looking to reconnect with someone from my past who needs to hear some important truths about her future. What made me respond wasn't the mysterious message. It was the profile photos. The woman in the pictures looked remarkably similar to me but older, with the same bone structure and facial features aged by what appeared to be about 2 decades. Her hair was different, her style more sophisticated, but the resemblance was so striking that several friends had already messaged me asking if I had an older sister I'd never mentioned. Our initial conversations were unlike anything I'd experienced on dating apps. Sarah2045 didn't ask typical getting-to-know-you questions. Instead, she referenced specific memories from my childhood that I'd never shared with anyone, mentioned the names of college roommates I hadn't spoken to in years, and seemed to know details about my family dynamics that would have been impossible for a stranger to discover. I know you're planning to quit your marketing job next month to pursue freelance graphic design, she wrote in her third message. I also know you're scared about the financial instability, but you're going to do it anyway because you can't stand your boss's micromanagement anymore. He was absolutely right. I'd been planning to give my notice for weeks but hadn't told anyone except my therapist. When I asked how she could possibly know this, Sarah2045 said we needed to meet in person for her to explain properly. I should have been more suspicious about someone who claimed to have impossible knowledge about my private life. But curiosity won out over caution, especially when Sarah2045 suggested meeting at a restaurant I'd never heard of but that she claimed would become my favorite place within the next year. When I arrived at the address she'd given me, I discovered a small Ethiopian restaurant tucked between a dry cleaner and a cell phone repair shop. I'd walked past this block hundreds of times without noticing it existed. But as soon as I stepped inside and smelled the spices, something about the atmosphere felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Sarah2045 was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, and seeing her in person was like looking into a funhouse mirror that showed me 20 years older. She had my eyes, my smile, even the same nervous habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. But she carried herself with a confidence I'd never possessed, and there was something sad and urgent in her expression that made me feel immediately uneasy. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I know how impossible this must seem, but I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. For the next hour, Sarah 2045 told me a story that was simultaneously the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard and the most terrifying. According to her, time travel had been perfected by 2043, initially for scientific research but quickly commercialized for personal use by people wealthy enough to afford it. The technology is still limited, she explained while we shared injera and various stews that tasted exactly like comfort food I'd never eaten before. You can only travel backward and only for short periods. Most people use it for tourism, visiting historical events, meeting ancestors, that sort of thing. But some of us have more urgent reasons for making the trip. She claimed to be me from the year 2045, returned to 2024 to warn my current self about a series of choices I was going to make that would lead to decades of regret and isolation. The life she described was successful on paper but emotionally devastated. A thriving design business built at the cost of every meaningful relationship I'd ever had. "You're going to become obsessed with success," she said, her voice heavy with what sounded like genuine remorse. "The freelance business takes off faster than you expect, and instead of finding balance, you double down on work. You push away everyone who tries to maintain connections with you because you convince yourself that relationships are distractions from building your empire." According to future me, I was going to spend my 30s and 40s accumulating professional achievements while systematically destroying every personal bond that mattered. She described watching our parents age from a distance because I'd been too busy with client deadlines to visit regularly. She talked about missing the weddings and baby showers of friends who eventually stopped inviting me because I always canceled at the last minute. By the time I realized what I'd sacrificed for career success, it was too late to rebuild most of those relationships, she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Mom died in 2041, and I hadn't had a real conversation with her in 3 years. Dad follows her 2 years later, and I'm essentially alone at both funerals because I'd burned bridges with everyone who used to care about me. The specificity of her predictions was unnerving. She knew about the client I was going to land in 6 months who would offer me the opportunity to expand nationally. She described the apartment I'd supposedly buy in 2027, complete with details about the view and the problematic neighbor on the 4th floor. She even mentioned a romantic relationship with someone named Marcus that wouldn't begin until 2029 but would end badly when I prioritized a business merger over his needs during a family crisis. But what disturbed me most wasn't the prediction of professional success or personal isolation. It was how intimately she understood my psychological patterns and motivations. She described the exact fears and insecurities that drove my workaholic tendencies, the ways I used achievement to avoid vulnerability, and the specific defense mechanisms I employed when people tried to get emotionally close to me. "I'm not here to tell you not to pursue your dreams," she said as we finished dinner. "I'm here to warn you that success without connection is just elaborate loneliness. You can build an amazing career without destroying your capacity for love and friendship, but only if you make conscious choices about what matters most." Throughout the evening, I kept waiting for Sarah 2045 to slip up, to reveal some detail that proved she was an elaborate con artist or delusional person who'd researched my life obsessively. But every story she told aligned perfectly with my memories, every prediction she made felt psychologically accurate, and her knowledge of my inner life was too complete to have been gathered through surveillance or social media stalking. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, I asked the question that had been bothering me all evening. "If you're really me from the future, prove it. Tell me something that's going to happen tomorrow that I couldn't possibly predict." Sarah 2045 smiled sadly. "You're going to get a call from your college roommate Jessica around 2 p.m. She's getting divorced and needs someone to talk to, but you'll let it go to voicemail because you're in the middle of a design project. You'll tell yourself you'll call her back later, but you won't remember until 3 weeks from now, and by then she'll have worked through the crisis without you." I wanted to argue that this was exactly the kind of vague prediction that could be made about anyone, but something about the specificity of Jessica's name and the timing felt uncomfortably accurate to my typical behavior patterns. "Promise me you'll answer that call," Sarah 2045 said as we stood up from the table. "It's a small choice, but it's the kind of small choice that determines whether you end up like me, professionally successful but personally hollow, or whether you find a way to build something meaningful with your life." As we walked outside, I realized I had no way to contact Sarah 2045 again. Her dating profile had disappeared from the app, and she hadn't given me a phone number or any other way to reach her. When I asked about this, she said our conversation was the only interaction we were allowed to have. Time travel comes with strict rules about altering the past, she explained. I've already pushed the boundaries by sharing as much as I have. Any more interference could create paradoxes that damage both our timelines. I spent the rest of the evening and all the next morning thinking about everything Sarah 2045 had told me. Part of me was convinced I'd had dinner with an elaborate con artist or someone experiencing a complex delusion. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I'd genuinely encountered a version of myself who'd lived through the consequences of choices I hadn't made yet. At exactly 2:03 p.m. the next day, my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I remembered Sarah 2045's prediction with a chill that ran down my spine. For a moment I stared at the phone, wondering if answering would prove that I'd really met my future self or just confirm that I was more predictable than I wanted to believe. I answered the call. Jessica was crying, explaining that her husband had asked for a divorce and she didn't know who else to talk to. Instead of letting her know I was busy with work, I closed my laptop and listened. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of the conversation I felt more connected to another human being than I had in months. Over the following weeks, I found myself making small but conscious choices about prioritizing relationships alongside professional ambitions. I couldn't stop thinking about the future Sarah 2045 had described: successful but isolated, accomplished but unloved. Whether she was real or imaginary, her warnings had forced me to examine aspects of my personality and goals I'd been avoiding. The Ethiopian restaurant became a regular spot for me, just as Sarah 2045 had predicted. The freelance transition happened exactly as she'd described, including the challenging client who offered national expansion opportunities. But instead of diving headfirst into workaholic patterns, I found myself pausing to consider the long-term costs of each professional choice. 6 months after the dinner with Sarah 2045, I still don't know if I really met my future self or if I encountered someone who understood my psychology well enough to create an elaborate intervention. But I do know that the experience changed how I think about success, relationships, and the choices that determine who we become over time. Whether Sarah 2045 was real or imaginary, she gave me the gift of seeing my potential future through the eyes of someone who'd lived it. That perspective has been invaluable for making decisions that align with my values rather than just my ambitions, even when those choices require sacrifice and vulnerability. Sometimes the most important conversations we have are with versions of ourselves we haven't become yet. Whether those encounters happen through literal time travel or through the power of imagination and self-reflection to show us possibilities we'd rather avoid.